Jon Kiper. As she said, I've been running a restaurant for the last 10 years in Newmarket, and I grew up in New Hampshire, grew up in Stratham, attended Exeter High School, and I've pretty much lived in New Hampshire my whole life, aside from a little couple of years I spent in Australia. So this book, Community First Economics, is really a culmination of several years of research that I did when I was prepping to run for governor in 2024. And after the 2024 election, I had started writing this book that was part memoir, the campaign trail, sort of behind the scenes drama, but then also laying out some more detailed policy stuff. And I got a manuscript done and I looked at it, and it was really two books. You know, it was a book about policy and it was a book about being in a campaign, but it was really not one book. And I thought, you know what, maybe I'll put this on hold and finish it after I run for governor again. So as we were gearing up to run the second time, we're again back doing all this research and, you know, checking out various tax policies and education funding and all these different things, trying very hard to find another tax that doesn't have the word income or sales in it. That took up a lot of time. And at a certain point, we also started looking for a slogan. You know, the Republicans, Trump had come up with "Make America Great Again," and love him or hate him, but it's a good slogan. People like it. It's catchy. You know, it sums up the whole thing in one, you know, few words. And it was really funny because me and my guys we were sitting there we're just spitting ideas out, and nothing was working, just nothing. And one day I was thinking, I you know, heard people on the right particularly having this idea of, you know, America first, like we're voting for Trump because it's America. And I thought, you know, what do we want? You know, what do we on the left want? What's our response to America first? What's our response to Make America Great Again? And I thought, what do I want to put first? You know, what do I want to make the most important thing? And it just dawned on me, it was community. It was my community in Newmarket and my greater community in New Hampshire. And that I really wanted to be a part of a movement that would use that as the goalpost. Because for so many years, you know, as a business owner and, you know, serving on the town council in Newmarket, I just felt like we were swimming sort of alone in this sea. It felt like the state government was kind of operating on their own. It felt like the federal government was also sort of doing their own thing. And we could barely afford our school. We could barely afford, you know, the basic things that we needed for our town to function. And for me, particularly as a small business owner, I had a restaurant that was in a building that was built in 1834, and it had no parking. And so once I bought the building in 2016, I thought, you know what, I'm gonna get involved and I'm gonna get some parking built. So I got on the various boards, ZBA and, you know, Energy and Environment Board, worked my way up to town council, formed the parking committee, and then we ran into a roadblock, which was there was no money. And the reason there was no money is because our school funding system and the fact that 70% of our property taxes were going to fund the school. And I thought, you know, this is really an issue that I can't fix from the town council level. This is a systemic issue in New Hampshire that I really need to move up the chain, if you will, to focus on. And that's when I looked at my options and I said, you know what, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to run for governor. And so once we had sort of come up with this idea of community first, and I started sort of using this slogan like community first economics, which originally just sort of meant that we were going to focus on lowering property taxes by funding the schools in a different way so that we could build more housing. And then it got to the point where the stump speech that I had, all the information I wanted to bring forth to people was significantly longer than the 15 or 20 minutes that you normally get to give your stump speech. And so I said to my guys, I was like, I think between all the research that we've done, like we've got a book here. And it was really funny because the two guys that were working with me are both in college. And they were like, man, there's no way you're going to get a book done in the next, you know, before the campaign's over. Like, there's no way that's possible. And there's nothing that excites me more than someone telling me that there's no way that I can do something. And it's really probably something that no one should ever say to me if they don't want to see that thing probably happen. Because I said to these guys, I was like, you just watch my my young apprentices because we're going to get this done. So I dug in and wrote this book. The first, the book really, it starts out with a story, and that story, frankly, sums up the whole concept of the book. And there was a gentleman who used to come into my restaurant about once a month. And one day he came in and he said, I want a burger, but I want a burger with barbecue pulled pork on it, a fried egg, cheddar cheese, and sriracha hot sauce. So this massive burger. And I said, all right, man. And he said, I'll pay whatever. I don't care. I said, all right, we'll make it. So we made it. And one of the other guys that was working for me, he made one for himself for lunch. He said, man, this is good. Let's put it on special. So we put it on special, and I just randomly called it the Big Kahuna Burger. And then we put it on the menu, called it the Big Kahuna, and it was a smash hit. So whenever this guy would come in, we'd say, oh, Big Kahuna's here. We'd make him his burger. And like I said, he'd only come in about once a month. But around Christmas, he started coming in like 3 times a week. And I got to know him a little better. And so one day I said, hey, man, just curious, not that I'm upset about it, but why are you coming in all the time? Did something change? Did you break up with your girlfriend or something? Like, why are you eating here 3 times a week? Because you're normally only here once. Like, what is this about? And he said, oh, I work at Best Buy. And most of the year, they only give me 20 hours. But around Christmas, they let me work overtime and because they need me to, sell electronics and they need me there more. And I said, why do they only give you 20 hours, through the year? And he said, well, that way they don't have to pay me benefits. And this is before the pandemic. So he was making like $9 or $10 an hour, really not very much money. And we're having this conversation and he said, if they paid me more, I would eat here more. And a light bulb went off in my head, and it's such a basic concept. But to have him spell it out like that, all of a sudden, the economics of my little town made so much more sense. In the fact that he couldn't eat as much because Best Buy needed to make more money at their corporate headquarters. And his whole entire life was built around this spreadsheet for some CEO to make $1 million or $1 billion more or whatever it was. And I started to just realize just this little ecosystem of the economy that we had in my little niche of Newmarket, where, there's a tattoo shop across the street. And when they were busy, they'd come in and order food. And if they were slow, they'd bring in their lunch. If the hairdresser, if she had a busy week, she'd come in for a margarita on Friday. If she didn't have a busy week, she wouldn't be. And all of a sudden, all these little things that, we argue about, like minimum wage, suddenly made more sense to me. Because as a business owner, I was always kind of afraid, $20 minimum wage, that's scary. But I'm thinking, if all my employees have $20 an hour and all the other employees in town have $20 an hour, and suddenly there's more money for them to buy burgers from me or books from, this bookstore or whatever it is. And I sort of started to realize that we had slowly let capitalism evolve to this point where it was basically serving one purpose, and that was just extracting money out of the middle class and out of the working class and siphoning it up to the most wealthiest people in our country. And as I looked, I realized, that is trickle-down economics. And this is the paradigm that we've been living in since Ronald Reagan, this idea that, generally the Republicans, but sometimes with the help of the Democrats, we cut taxes for wealthy people and for corporations, and then the money is supposed to come magically, trickling down to us. And I think it's fair to say after this 40-year experiment, it didn't work. And it was never going to work. And that's really why, I wanted something different, a new approach that was literally the exact opposite of trickle-down economics. And fundamentally, that's what my book is about. It's about presenting a new paradigm and just a new way of thinking about not only what the economy does, but how the government and the economy work together to ensure that our communities are strong and thriving. Another example was that during the pandemic, my employees came to me and they said, hey, Johnny, our rent is going up. And I said, okay. They said, we need raises. I'm like, all right. So I gave them raises. To do that, I raised the prices of my tacos. And my barber, Dan, comes in, he's eating the tacos. And then I go to his barber shop to get a haircut. And now the haircut's $5 more because he's paying $2 more for tacos. Fair enough. And And it kind of dawned on me, I'm paying more for tacos, or he's paying more for tacos. I'm paying more for haircuts. My employees are paying more for rent. We're all seeing more money coming toward travel through our bank accounts. But at the end of the day, in a way, we're all poor. No one has benefited from this except for maybe the lucky landlord who happened to buy the building, decades ago. So that made me really want to change the way that we just looked at the economy in general and to get away from this idea of extraction capitalism. Another huge issue that I talk about probably more than anything else in the book is housing. And, as I was just saying, as people's rent went up in my little corner of the town, and this happened in Newmarket where people were paying $1,200 one day and the next day they're paying $1,700. People's rent's going up $300-$400, and generally nothing changed in their apartment. They didn't get new dishwasher, they didn't paint or anything. Just the landlord said, "Hey, the market price has gone up for rent, and now you need to pay me more rent." And as this happens, now suddenly they have less money to spend at my restaurant. And I could just slowly see this happening with the pandemic, and I was like, "Wow, this is really an issue." I can't sustain my business if someone is now paying 70% of their income towards rent. And that has just happened to so many people in our state over the last, 5 or so years, that they're paying more and more towards rent and mortgage to the point where it's really not sustainable. Another thing that I go into in the book that I learned before I had written this book, but I learned about it a lot more in depth while I was researching this book. And this, I think, is really interesting for anyone who's concerned about the housing crisis. And that is just the origin of zoning laws. I got on the ZBA in 2016, and the ZBA is Zoning Board of Adjustment. Very boring board if you don't know. They approve, if someone wants to do something with their property that's not normally allowed, they give them permission to do it. And I was kind of wondering, where do these zoning laws come from? It's just sort of this thing that happens and we just sort of acknowledge, we just go along with zoning laws. And I researched it and found out that zoning laws originated in France. And the original idea was, we need to keep industrial areas where maybe there's a tannery or they're polluting away from the residential area. We don't want to mix pollution areas where people are living. Pretty basic idea. But what happened in the United States is, around the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, the people that were implementing these zoning laws realized something. They're like, hey, we can use these zoning laws to say that black people and brown people are going to live over here, and only white people get to live over here. And they did this for a little while, and eventually, the courts caught up with them and said, hey, you can't specifically say that you're not going to let black people or brown people live in this area. But what you can do is you can say you got to have a house and you got to have 2 acres. No apartments, no duplexes, no multifamilies. And guess what? You get basically the same outcome, because the black and brown people can't afford the white picket fence in the house with 2 acres. So we have effectively zoned this economic and racial discrimination into our very fabric of how we decide where we build houses. And once I knew that, and I was going to these planning board meetings and hearing the way people would sometimes talk, I was like, I don't think you guys quite understand where these ideas come from. And I think if you did, you would be approaching this with a slightly different attitude. At one point when I was on the ZBA, I started pushing for ADUs, which is accessory dwelling units in people's backyards. And I had learned about this issue because there's a couple people I knew in town who wanted to put an apartment in their barn or their garage, and they got denied. And this happened when I was on the ZBA. So when I got on the town council, I kept bugging them. I'm like, hey, we guys got to fix this rule. We got to change this law because it doesn't make any sense to me. Why shouldn't someone be able to put an apartment in their barn or in their garage? And we had a hearing about it, and it was so interesting because one of the people that spoke at the hearing, who was pretty well involved in town, said he paused for a second. He goes, I don't think we should pass this law because it could change the complexion of Newmarket. Now, I don't think he was a racist person. I don't think he intended it to come out that way. But knowing what I knew at the time, I thought, this sounds really bad. This sounds really bad. And there was people there who, very progressive people, progressive, very progressive Democrats who were saying, oh, well, we can't really have apartments next to single family homes. This is madness. We couldn't have two people living in one unit. And it just was really funny to me because I knew the history and I said, why? Why does this matter to you? Especially if it's not, even in your neighborhood. And so that's kind of a lot of what I put into this book is I got to this point with the campaign where I thought, if everyone knew what I've learned over the last couple of years, I think that their attitude towards a lot of these issues would be very different. Another really interesting fact I learned, I think this is probably, one of the most important, is, when we're talking about property taxes in New Hampshire, it's 70% of your local public school comes from your property taxes, which is one of the reasons that they continue to go up and up and up. And we talk about this number a lot, especially, in circles of people that are trying to fix this issue. But we don't talk about as much as this other 30%. So we get about, 60, 70% comes from the town and 20 so percent comes from the state, 20 to 30. And the last little bit, 8 to 10% comes from the federal government. And when I was researching the book, I thought to myself, what do they do in other countries? I've traveled in Australia and I've been around the world and just what do they do? And would it surprise you to find out that in basically every other industrialized country in the world, the central government pays 50% of the public school costs, 70, even 80% of the public school costs? And you think about what would happen to our property taxes if the federal government was paying 50% and not 10% like they are right now, how that would change the dynamics. It's that one fact has really, pushed me to look at this issue of how we fund our schools in a much broader way. And, like for instance, in Japan, all the teachers make relatively the same amount. There's no reason for a teacher to go from one school district to another for money. She's going to stay in the place, the community where they want to live, as opposed to driving 45 minutes for an extra, $10,000 or $20,000 a year, which just makes a lot of sense. And the more you think about it, you think, what do we get for paying taxes? Because it's not public schools, federal tax for paying our income tax and sales tax. And how come we never are asking our federal representatives why this is? And even when I try to bring it up with people, they just say, oh, well, public school funding that's a town issue. That's your town's fault. I'm like, well, why does it have to be? Why do we just assume that something that doesn't work needs to be a system that we're going to perpetuate as opposed to try to completely replace or at least, evolve along the way? So it was just very interesting because many of the things that I found while researching the book, I discovered that what I thought was a new idea was actually something that we used to do for many years. Like at one point, I had an employee that was on Section 8 housing, and she would have to get income verifications from me periodically. And at one point she said, oh, my rent is going up. My landlord just informed me my rent is going up. But the landlord said, don't worry about it because the government's just going to pay more. And I thought, so the landlord just raised the rent and then, Section 8 goes up and then the federal government's just paying more money. I thought, this seems very odd. Why wouldn't the federal government just build housing and then have people that are on Section 8 live in housing that they had built so we can cut out the middleman, cut out the profit, and just manage it kind of ourselves? Wouldn't that be a novel idea? Turns out that's what they used to do. And it turns out, in fact, that not only did we used to build Section 8 housing, the federal government from the mid-1930s until roughly 1980 built hundreds of thousands of housing units, for low-income folks, but just they were investing in the community in a way that is not socialism, is not communism, but just made sense at the time. One of the really cool things I discovered was in the lead up to World War I, the federal government realized there wasn't enough housing around the bases and around the industrial centers where we knew we need to build up all these munitions. So they created the United States Housing Corporation, and they built thousands of housing units all over the country in these beautiful neighborhoods. They had the best architects, the best city planners, and a lot of those neighborhoods still exist. So it just goes to show that the federal government, there was a time when they saw a problem and they would just fix it. And if it was housing, they would just fix it. There wasn't this debate over whether this is socialism or whether this is communism. It was just taking care of the community when we needed to. Um, the last story that I'll tell really quick is I was listening to NHPR it's probably 10 plus years ago. And they were talking about property taxes in New Hampshire. And this woman came on and she called in and she said, I'm retired and I live in the northern part of the state. And she said, if it was up to me, we wouldn't let any more families into our town. I don't want any more kids moving to our town because I don't want to pay for the schools. I don't want my taxes going up. And I just sat there and I thought, that's crazy. That's crazy. How could you want to live in a town without kids? And what does that mean for us as a society if we built this sort of relationship between retired folks and children, where the retired folks don't want children around because of tax reasons? I mean, it just seems just splitting up our entire community at the seam, and just really dividing us along these lines that just seems really not helpful for getting things going. So I'm just going to finish by reading a little chunk of the book. I know normally people probably read a lot more out of their books, but I'm hoping that you will buy the book and have to read it yourself. Child well-being is economic policy, cultivating the seedlings of our future. I often see cruel comments aimed at struggling parents, especially single mothers. If you can't afford kids, you shouldn't have them. This attitude is not only heartless, it's economically and morally illiterate. It ignores the most fundamental truth there is. Our children are not a private hobby. They are the future. Human civilization is a relay race. One generation passes the baton to the next. For millennia, societies understood this and invested in their young. The intergenerational contract of care has been in tatters since we decided to treat children as consumer choices rather than as a shared responsibility and our most precious common asset. Supporting children from birth through adulthood is a strategic investment in our community's most vital infrastructure. When children thrive, towns thrive in perpetuity. When children struggle, we all pay the price for generations in diminished potential, in reactive spending, and in a frayed social fabric. This is the essence of community-first economics. The recognition that the pursuit of happiness is a multi-generational project. We cannot secure our own well-being on the broken backs of our children. Their foundation is our collective foundation. Thank you. So I would love to take some questions, if anyone's got one.
Well, I was thinking about that story about the woman in the north and not wanting to have kids, and what you didn't say, but what I think you meant was, now because she has to pay more money, the incentives are in the wrong place, right?
Yeah.
So how do we help these people, right, so that they don't have to pay more money? But where is the money going to come from?
Yeah.
Because that's a big question that I have. But also, and I'm thrilled that you're running for governor. It's good to hear your voice and get to know who you are. So my name is Laura Monfeld from Portsmouth.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I'm curious, if you do win, and you might just win, what are your priorities going to be in the first year? Have you thought about that?
Yes.
I don't want to get ahead of you.
Sure.
But it is a question that's
in terms of taxation, I have a whole chunk of the book about that. And basically, the reality is that, especially in New Hampshire, the lowest 20% of the population is paying about 9% of their income towards taxes right now, when you add the totality of it. The top 20, the bottom 20% of income earners are paying about 9% of their income towards total taxation. That means when you factor everything in. And the top is paying a little bit, around 2%. So this is kind of the inequity in the system, particularly in the education funding, because we end up, as we know, for 30 years of the Claremont lawsuits, towns and cities like Claremont just having much worse educational outcomes. And without getting too deep into the weeds, basically what I propose in the book is getting back to the taxation we had in the year 2000. We used to have an interest and dividends tax that brought in a couple $100 million. We used to have higher business taxes, which the thing about the business taxes, it's really important for people to understand is, when they cut 0.5%, or something. And the Republicans will do this periodically, and it's sort of just throwing a bone to their base. Hey, we cut taxes. And like, for instance, for my restaurant, the rooms and meals went from 9 to 8.5. Now, for me as a restaurant owner, as a small business owner, that's a couple $1,000s a year. Not enough to hire anybody, really not enough to buy any equipment or invest. It's minimal. Now, if you owned 20 McDonald's, that would be probably a couple $1,000,000. But the point is that at the aggregate, after 10 years of this, it's billions of dollars. So when they cut the business taxes in 2015, the amount of money that we have not gained because of those cuts, even though it might have only been a 0.5%, 1% here and there, we just lost tons and tons of money over, and it's pretty much since the year 2000. This has got to do with a lot of factors, but if we get back to that, what we were doing then, we were at least not drowning fiscally, which is what we're dealing with right now. Another big thing I get to a little bit in the book is I think the future is taxing wealth and not work. And the reason I think that is because as AI and robots and automation take more jobs, there's going to be fewer and fewer people with any income to pay income taxes and fewer people with income to pay any sort of sales tax. So that's where, frankly, the interest in dividends tax was a great tax. It was proposed in 1923 or enacted in 1923, almost lasted barely 100 years. And the vast majority of the people paying it were multimillionaires. Dr. Tom Sherman, who ran for governor, told me at one point, he said, just think about how much the Sununu family alone would have benefited, from that one reduction. And so, we have got a really hard job in New Hampshire about explaining to the average Best Buy employee who might be a Republican-leaning person why a tax on the wealthy is not going to be a tax on them. And it's really hard because they have been, I had someone say to me the other day, I said, oh, we need to tax the rich, interest and dividends tax. And they said, oh, by rich, he just means everybody. So, was there a second question? About what I was going to do. Yeah. I think, especially because it's a 2-year term, the lowest hanging fruit, in my opinion, will be legalizing cannabis, taxing it, using that money for housing. I think, and it's not going to be a ton of money, but it'll be at least some revenue. I think trying to push, and it really depends on how things end up in the state house and the Senate, particularly the Senate. It's heavily gerrymandered and will be probably until 2030. So how do we deal with that in the interim? And if we're going to have to work with the Republicans, how do we do it to get some things done? It's not going to be easy. And there's, frankly, some of the bigger ideas that I have in this book, the reason I am planting these seeds now is because they might not happen for a decade. A really interesting thing I learned is that, most of the New Deal ideas were first presented by the People's Party about 40 years prior. So sometimes you plant the seed now, and it might take a decade before this stuff happens. But I think what's going to happen is the economics, if we don't pivot, are going to get continuously worse and worse and worse. And I hope that as that happens, the message spreads and people are like, hey, what's the alternative to what we're doing now? Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm an educator, and I'm wondering, I'm watching things change, and I'm seeing my colleagues and myself start to get worried, and people really not understanding where we're headed, because it's been packaged in this school choice, and that things are going to be better for all the kids, and I don't think that people really understand what's happening and where we're going. And you've alluded to there being a problem.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how we can possibly shift that, or what your ideas might be for what that would look like if you were to be governor. What?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a number of bad policies that we're pursuing right now, particularly the vouchers that we really, frankly, can't afford. And I think that the change will come, and I think it is coming when people in places like Claremont, who generally are voting sometimes against their better interests, realize that. And I think if you look at the number of towns who are looking at their budgets and saying, Nash was talking about laying off 70 teachers. I mean, these are massive cuts. I have a friend in Claremont. He coaches football. They have to drive the kids to the football games because they can't afford to pay for the bus. So they drive the kids. I mean, it's the rubber's really hitting the road here in terms of a couple decades of really neglect of the system. So, I hate to say it, but it's one of those things where sometimes things need to get bad for people to wake up and go, hey, we need like not incremental change, but a big change in the way that we, just the way that we all look at education funding. And that if, there's a kid in Newmarket that is doing well in school and we invest in him, he might be the nurse in Exeter that are getting taken care of in a decade or 2 decades, and that it's one system. Likewise with housing. If we don't build an apartment building in Newmarket, it might not be homeless people in Newmarket. It might be homeless people in Manchester. It's one big system. So I think that's kind of another underlying idea in the book is looking at your community as not just your town, but like the whole of New Hampshire, and that we're all in this together, and we sort of need to get more of that attitude as opposed to, I'm a resident of this town or this city, and I'm only going to worry about this budget, and thinking in a bigger picture about the whole state as one unit. Dan.
And you talked about advocating for ADUs in Newmarket, and that's pretty much come to fruition. Do you have other ideas about expanding the housing sector?
Yeah, I when thinking about the zoning a lot, and I initially had a bigger chunk in the book about this, and I think I edited a bit of it out, but I would love to see just a more holistic approach to how we look at housing, in the sense of having a more diverse type of housing all in the same area. We do this thing where we sort of like monocrop housing, where it's like, okay, this section's only going to be, 2,000 square foot, 4-acre lots, all the same. And then the apartments are all over here, and maybe have a mobile home park here. But I would really like to have a situation where you could say, where a developer, or you could say to a developer, like, look, you want to build 20 McMansions. How about we'll give you 15 McMansions. You got to do 1 or 2 duplexes plus 4 tiny homes. Because I think in the same way that monocropping is bad, having all the same crops on 5 acres or 10 acres, for the same reason, you don't really want the same type of housing in one area. And if we diversify it, I think not only will it be better because it will incentivize economic or more affordable housing, much in the way that a first-class seat might pay for an economy seat. But I think it also bring our people of different socioeconomic backgrounds together in a way that we've kind of isolated ourselves. You don't have a lot of times where someone in a mobile home park is interacting with someone that lives in a McMansion. I mean, maybe at school, there is some times, but we've kind of isolated ourselves, and I think that's politically bad. Yeah, it's bad for social cohesion.
Integration.
Yeah.
So it seems like your thoughts on this are very progressive, but they're packaged in a way that can be very palatable for conservatives. Have you had anybody from like a conservative background kind of tell you that or give their thoughts on this?
It's kind of funny because I have always tried with my political sort of ideas to be thinking of my conservative uncles, frankly. And I literally think of them, R.I.P. Uncle Matt. But it was kind of funny because my Uncle Matt, who passed away recently, or a couple, what was that? Was that a year ago? Last year? Sorry, Mom. But he at one point said to me, he was watching some of my videos on social media. He said, man, you're more conservative on taxation than some of my Republican friends. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it was, all I had to say was, I don't want to pay more taxes than I have to. I don't like paying tax. Like, no one likes paying taxes. Let's just be okay with saying that. It's not, but we have to. Somebody has to pay taxes. And, and I don't want a huge government. I mean, frankly, the way that New Hampshire functions, I like a lot of the aspects, especially as a restaurant owner. We're not micromanaged in a lot of the aspects. Sometimes we've gone a little bit too, in many departments where we're not even hitting sort of the benchmark that we need to be hitting. We need more money for that. But there are some aspects where I think sometimes when governments get a lot of money, they start doing kind of frivolous and stupid things. And I think that's against the New Hampshire general ethos. I also think it's really important to explain to people who say, oh, I'm a fiscal conservative, Well, does it make sense for us to, cut taxes to the point where, this road, if we had just maintained it a little bit every couple years, as opposed to doing no maintenance on it for 10 years, and now it's going to cost us 10 times as much, and explain to people like, hey, frequently in this state, our legislative body is penny wise and pound foolish, and it just ends up costing us more and more money. A great example would be the YDC abuse cases, decades of abuse of these kids, and now we're on the hook for $1.5 billion. And had we spent $1 million or whatever on better supervision over the course of those many decades, we probably wouldn't be in this situation. And so I think there's a lot of conservatives that this idea would appeal to, that we need to spend money, and we're really kind of in a ways robbing our children. Like if we don't raise taxes and we don't build new water, put in new water pipes or new roads or whatever, our kids are just gonna have to do it anyway. So it's kind of trying to get them to think of more, again, community, and what's a community going to be like, not just for me but for my kid. Abe.
Between the year 2000 and 2020, there's only about 158,000 additional New Hampshire residents. What do you owe to the housing crunch in New Hampshire when there's not so many additional people?
That's a good question. I think there's a number of reasons. One would be, this is kind of interesting, but baby boomers getting divorced has been a one propellant in the housing crisis, where now you have two people that need two houses, and they used to be in one house. I think also just, I'm trying to think of more examples like that. Yeah, I mean, I think that probably is a factor. The Airbnbs, that sort of thing.
Residency in Florida,
Yeah,
but having a place up here too.
yeah. I have to look at that stat because I'm curious as to as how that got up. Because I mean, right now they're talking about that we need like 20,000 units per year till 2040 or something. Yeah. Anyone else have any other questions?
Can I?
Go for it.
You talked about taxing, doing an income tax. Of course, that's going to curl a whole lot of toes in the conservative community. But I mean, I'm a flat tax guy. I think, I don't think people could be averse to that. Can you, yay or nay? What's your feelings on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think income tax is going to be almost impossible to pass in the state of New Hampshire. And I say that based on the fact that a poll just came out saying 70% of the people in New Hampshire were against income tax. So I think that there's ways to raise the revenue without those things. I think that we just really need to come up with, a New Hampshire solution. And that's where, it's a 2-year cycle for the governor. So I think it's really important for people to understand. I would need probably 6 years to do massive overhaul of the taxation system, which in my mind, we get in there for the first 2 years. And then I really, again, with the book, it's about having a conversation, and getting people to think about these things and not assume that just because we've been doing something for the last 100 years that we need to continue doing that. And we should ask ourselves, are these things working? And if they're not, what are all the options? Let's consider them all and have a good debate amongst people. Because one thing I'll tell you about school funding, just taxation in general, in my restaurant, I talk to many people from many different backgrounds. And I have talked to libertarians about this, Republicans, and almost everyone has agreed the system as it sits is not really working. And many people they will tell you what they think we should do. They'll say, oh, we should have a sales tax, we should have an income tax, we should have value-added tax, whatever it is. And the idea to me is that we just need to get everyone in a series of forums like this to share their opinion and come up with a consensus. I think that's one of the issues we've had in the past is like with the statewide education property tax, that we didn't have a strong enough consensus, and people didn't realize how it was going to be implemented. And then once they did, they said, oh, hey, we don't like this system. So I think it's important not to do something that in 4, 6, 8 years is going to get, vetoed or rescinded.
I've heard you talk about our citizen legislature and their compensation. Can you hit on that briefly?
Sure, yeah. It's kind of funny because I didn't actually get into that in the book because it's probably a book unto its own. But it's an issue that I ran into basically as soon as I wanted to get involved in politics in New Hampshire, where the state reps don't get paid. And as I researched that more, I discovered New Hampshire is the only state that does not pay its state reps. In the whole country, even very poor states like New Mexico and Louisiana and whatever, they pay their state reps. Maine, and not a lot, $10,000. We're not talking. Some of them pay more. Mass and New York pay quite a bit more. But as a result, there's this barrier to who can participate in the legislature, and I think that is probably the biggest impact on our outcomes in Concord. I think that's probably the biggest one.
It's intentional.
I mean, it's hard to say if it's intentional. I think what happened is once you've got the power, because the only people that could fix it are the state reps, right? And I did a bunch of research into this because this is actually a really hilarious story about why they get paid $100. What happened is in 1889, they were having a convention, and they were going to do change the Constitution, right? And one of the state reps, I can't remember where he's from, but he said at the time they were getting paid $3 a day, which is about $100 a day. And the session, they did it in about 6 or 8 weeks. They just banged it all out, as opposed to now they do 1 day a week for 6 months. So it's kind of supposed to be this tight, we just get in, we do the work. And one of the reps said, I think some of these other guys are really kind of dragging out the clock. I think they're sort of dragging out the calendar so that they get paid more. And he said, we should make it $100 because that's roughly what we make in 6 weeks. And that's how long it should take us to get the people's work done. And so he said, if it's one set amount, as soon as that money is, as soon as we hit the 6 or 8 week mark, everyone's going to want to wind it up. No one's going to be talking, and would just be concise and fast and efficient. And from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense, because anyone who sat through a meeting, a city council meeting or something with someone who likes to talk, you're like, oh, let's wrap it up. It's, we've been here for 4 hours. So I find that to be kind of a really insightful piece of information, because it was not, they act like this $100 was at a time some sort of, that there was a reason behind it that is not true. But the issue is that they themselves would be the ones to have to fix it. And I don't think they clearly don't want to do that. So it's an issue that
Why don't they want to do it?
because they would then have to deal with more people that would be eligible for their seats.
They'd have riffraff in their club, right?
Well, and I mean, it's a lot of riffraff right now, but it would mean that the pool of eligible people would suddenly expand. Because basically right now, if you're not retired, you have to have a very specific job. I know some nurses that do it because they can kind of work on the weekends. I know some bartenders that do it. But what there isn't is a lot of like 22, 23-year-olds fresh out of poli-sci major, ready to go do the people's work. And the thing that makes it really hard is if you're trying to get a coalition together or a group of people to all get in there and focus on one issue, it's just such a small group of people that you can ask to do it with you. And if you talk to some of the people that run some of the town and county committees, it's just a brutal job trying to find people to run. And I've even been in a room. I was in a room once. I can't remember where it was, but somewhere around here. And they said, oh, Sally's going to run for state rep. We convinced Sally to run. And she's retired, and she's literally sitting there going, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it, but I'll do it if nobody else is going to do it. I talked to another woman who was retired in Manchester. We were holding signs for Jess Spillers, who was running for mayor, and it was so funny because she was in her, I think, second year, and I said, how do you like it? How's it going being state rep? She's like, I hate it. It's so ridiculous. She's like, you can't get anything done. It's 400 people. The committees are a mess. It's completely disorganized. So I have written this whole other plan for how we need to completely revamp the entire state of New Hampshire's government, because it's like a computer operating on an 1889 software. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And the ways that when they're doing their legislative procedures, that they can just circumvent the entire democratic process is just crazy. I mean, I went up there and testified about a bill it basically was going to make it so that after your lease was up, your landlord could just evict you without any reason. And the way the law had been prior is that your lease would go month to month until you wanted to leave. And so I went up there and testified. Everyone testified. We said, we don't want this. You're going to evict a bunch of people at the time we have a housing crisis. This isn't a good idea. Everyone pretty much testifying was against the bill. The bill did not get out of committee. And somehow this guy figured out another legislative procedure to tack it on to some other bill that had to go through, some budgetary movement. And so it got passed anyway. And I mean, the number of times that they'll have bills that like everyone in the public is against, and then it just happens anyway. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, this last session was insane. Like the Republicans that just at one point said, we're just not doing any more bills. We're just not doing any more Democrat bills. And it was like a couple hundred bills they basically just tabled. I mean, people have put a lot of work into this. And at a certain point, you just look at the whole thing and it seems like the people in it can't quite recognize like just the complete insanity of the whole project, And it's really hard because they and I get it, if you've been there for 20 years, you have a sense of, this is just how it is. Yeah.
So I've heard you say now a few times that this could be a whole nother book.
Yeah.
Are you planning on writing any more books on different aspects of policy?
Yeah, I definitely. There was a whole section originally. I had this whole big section at the end specifically about AI, and about how the changes to the economy with AI and robots and automation were going to be so drastic that we needed something like this to basically be like, hey guys, like we got to have a reason to keep the economy going. We got to have, but at the end of the day, it sort of seemed like a whole nother book. But I think that topic particularly is one that not enough people are talking about, not enough people are realizing what's coming down the pipeline and just how drastically it could change everything. I mean, another reason why I want to have the reps paid is because I think the challenge of AI is going to be so massive. You're going to want people in there that are professional and understand that, you're not going to be able to just say we're not raising taxes or we're not going to try something new because it's going to be just shaking the core of our entire economy. I mean, just fundamentally, it's really hard to see how capitalism functions in the way it does in the United States when you have robots and AI doing a bunch of jobs. I think so few people are really thinking about that, and you've got people that think it's going to go away or something, or that it's and they're kind of afraid of it, and it's a tool and it exists there, and we just need to prepare, I think, emotionally in a lot of ways for how different the world could be if robots could take a third of the jobs or whatever it is. Go for it.
Thanks for your time.
No worries. Thank you.
I feel like a lot of people, never mind outside of New Hampshire, right? The world is worlding right now.
Yeah.
Plenty of things going on, and I think a lot of us, a lot of what you're talking about, I think would resonate across political parties, ideologies, etc. I think they are common themes that everybody is reacting to and resonating with. And what I personally look for, is not a catalog of the issues.
Yeah.
Which is an important part.
Yeah.
But also, that's not, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's important to talk about those things. But a barrier for those of us who agree with the kinds of things you're talking about is, how do we paint a picture for the voter today about what to do, for instance, in the first 2 years, and why that matters 6 years from now?
Yeah.
How do we say, you can't see it yet? There are two ways that it's happening. Pain, which I work in addiction recovery.
Yeah.
And mental health, and people come to me when they're in pain and they're looking for relief, and there are things that my colleagues and I can say, yes, you are getting your butt kicked, you're not imagining it.
Yeah.
But here are some compass points, and recovery is possible. And that vision that clearly so it's pain, or hopefully not as much pain, and a clearly articulated vision for here's why. So for instance, in the first 2 years, it's a point well taken, right? You get 2 years. Like, what can you even do? let's say we passed cannabis and we had some money for housing. I got it. Sounds great. And that's a building block on the way to what? And how do we? Do you see what I'm driving at?
Yeah.
How do you like if we waved our wand and you're sort of like you know you have a bunch of vision, bunch of ideas related to specific topics. What is the thesis? Where are you headed, Jon?
Yeah. I think the thesis is that fundamentally inequality is the problem. That's really important for people to understand. Inequality is the problem. Trump did not cause our problems. He is a symptom of inequality. And we basically, for the sake of society and in keeping social cohesion, we have to tax the rich to fix inequality. We have to do it. And it's actually a historical fact that if we don't do it in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be massive upheaval. This happened in Rome. This happened in France. This happened in the United States in 1929. And so, and there was this and there's basically constantly this two options of massive reform or revolution. Now the revolution side of it, who knows where that ends, you know? So I'm advocating for the reform side of it. And I think also, you know, to me, and this is again, this other book about AI, I think that there is a vision of the future that is actually awesome, you know? And in fact, I think we are at this very, in my mind, somewhat scary, but also exciting time where we are in what I would call a historical bifurcation point, okay, a split off. Now there's really only two options. The AI is either used for continued wealth extraction and extenuating the inequality to every aspect of our lives, or the other side of it is getting towards this sort of techno utopia, you know, and either one of these options is completely possible, but we have to work right now, you know, because the window is about 5 to 10 years, I think. Maybe longer. Maybe if some of these AI data centers don't get built, maybe there's an energy crisis and we can't do that and it slows down. That would be great. Maybe they come up with some hang up with the technology. Who knows? That would be great too. But in a way, if you think about it, this is kind of like the pinnacle of the human experience. You know, that we now have these machines that could do the work for us. You know, this is what we've been trying to do for literally thousands and thousands of years, is build a machine to grow food so that we didn't have to work in the fields. You know, and we had a number of ways, machines that we built to do that over the years. And this is kind of the final point where we could really be spending our lives doing, you know, amazing things, helping each other, or, you know, writing that book you've always wanted to write, or whatever. And so I think there is really a great vision for the future, but it requires, I think, people selling it in a way that seems genuine and not coming from the tech guru himself who's telling you, oh, don't worry, we'll give you your UBI, we'll give you the things that you need. I think it's going to come because we all recognize the futures that are possible and then are able to sort of demand the better possibility, frankly, while we still can. If that makes sense. But yeah, I think you're right. I think one big issue on the left is that we have failed to do proper world building, storytelling about the future and what that could look like. And I mean, just a simple, I mean, like I said earlier, imagine if the federal government was paying 50% of our public school costs, you know, instead of sending billions of dollars to do war in Iran. You know, I mean, $2 billion a day that war is costing us. You know? And yet we can't even find, you know, school buses for the kids in Claremont. Like that contrast to me, I think, is getting to this point where it's going to be inescapable for the average person to just turn on the news and go, what are we doing here? What is our priority as a country? Was our priority as a state? And I think, and I hate to say it, but it will require potentially more pain for more people to wake up. But I think the job losses are going to be so drastic.
All the more reason why I think messaging around the solutions needs to be one of the core things that we're working on, so that when people are finally softened up and they're like, "Oh my God, there's a clearly articulated vision. We do this, then we do that, then we do the other thing."
Yeah.
I think if you took our economic landscape and instead of being, you know, split into the trailer park over here and the giant McMansions and Elon with his million infinity pools, right?
Yeah.
On some private island. If you put everybody in the same house, literally,
Yeah.
like 100 people, and one of the people had 52% of the house and all of the resources and everything, those people in that house would figure things out a lot quicker than we are right now.
Yeah.
And I think the bad faith operators, the corporate, Vikings, who are soaking us dry, own the means of communication. They own all the most powerful communication tools and platforms. And I just think, in these little in-person community analog experiences that we're having together, sharing that message, honing it, is going to be a really, really important experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I will point out I have a whole chapter in here that goes to the history of the corporation, because it's really quite interesting, and a lot of people don't know this, but when corporations first were created, it was supposed to be for public good. It was not supposed to be simply a wealth extraction. And there's a series of court cases, one big one actually in New Hampshire, in Dartmouth College in the early 1900s, that led to where we are now. But again, it's asking people to look back at sort of the lessons over the last 100 years and go, what have we learned, and are we better off from these advancements? And a lot of times in policy, there's not always, we'll try something. Like, for instance, with housing, Reagan said, hey, we don't need all these federally funded housing developments. The market will take care of it. And now we're sitting here 40 years later, and no one's saying, hey, we tried that 40-year experiment with having the market do it, and the market didn't do it. And there's not enough, I think, of a look back and going, oh, let's, we tried this experiment, it failed, let's try something new. And that's really what the book is about. It's looking at these things critically, but also saying, like, what has worked around the world? There's a great part in housing where I go into some really successful models. The Austrians have a great, subsidized housing model. There's Co-op City, which is in New York. It's, I think, 50,000 people live in a couple cooperatively owned buildings that they've been running democratically for decades. And so there's some really great solutions out there. But a lot of times, the problem is Americans don't travel. We don't travel enough. And I've traveled enough to sort of experience these things and see what it's like. And you can sort of come back and say, hey, I went to Australia. Roundabouts actually make a lot of sense, And I think that perspective is important. And I think the biggest thing is just getting the conversation going, about questioning all these aspects of the economy and how they function, and how the government and the economy should be working together to fundamentally enable people to pursue happiness. That's really a core tenet of the book, is that our government was created under this idea of, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Like, this should be our anthem. It should be our goal, and you can't pursue happiness when you're hungry or homeless or, suffering from addiction. So I think that's a really core part, is just getting back to what is the original function of the government, what was it supposed to be, and it's not doing that now. Yes, that's great. Back to mission, yeah. All right, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate everyone coming out. Thank you. Oh, we've got all sorts of plans. Yeah.
And you got a crew?
I do, yes. Yeah, we've been having
I just got on your website.
Oh, did you? Oh, good. Yeah, we've got a regular group of volunteers. A couple of them are actually here. So we
Are you related to Chris Kiper?
I am. He's actually right there. Do you know him?
Yeah, South Church.
Oh, you go to South Church too?
Yeah.